Thank you, Dean Flagg, and that was a wonderful introduction, and I'm glad that all of you all are here. I hardly made it yesterday. I was flying from Atlanta to Baltimore, and our flight actually was diverted twice. I touched down first in Norfolk, Virginia. We were cleared to come back to Baltimore, touched down again in Richmond, and sat there for 4 hours before we were finally cleared to get here. But you know, I had to come. I had to come home, and so I'm very glad that you all are here too. I want to spend some time sharing some tools for a national conversation on racism, because I think that's a conversation that will help heal our nation. But before we start talking, I guess the first tool that I'm going to give you for engaging in a conversation on racism is a framework for understanding levels of health intervention, because otherwise people would ask, why are you as a public health professional or a public health student even talking about racism? So I'm going to start out with a cartoon animation that's all about levels of health intervention. Here we go. Whoops, boom. Somebody just fell off of the cliff of good health. And if that were you or somebody in your family, you would be delighted to find an ambulance there at the bottom of the cliff to speed you on to care. But if we were concerned about others who might come along that cliff face, if we were concerned about population health, community health, public health, we might well ask ourselves, what could we put in place besides just stationing lots of ambulances at the bottom? So somebody in this room is going to say, I know, let's put a net halfway down. Because even if people fall, we can catch them before they get crunched up at the bottom. And that's an excellent idea. Except we also all recognize that nets have holes in them, so some people might fall through the cracks. So we could even make that a trampoline halfway down, no holes in a trampoline. But even if we had a trampoline halfway down that cliff, you know, we might find ourselves with lots of people just bouncing up and down at half functionality, not able to get back to the top of the cliff. So what else could we put in place as a health intervention? Well, clearly we should be thinking about a fence, right, at the edge of the cliff to keep people from falling in the first place. But as useful a strategy as that is, that's going to have to be a very, very strong fence if there's a lot of population pressure against it. So what else can we do as a health intervention? We can focus our efforts on moving the population away from the edge of the cliff. So I'm going to label the interventions that I've depicted so far, where the ambulance clearly represents medical care and tertiary prevention, preventing complications from disease that's already manifest. The net or trampoline represents our safety net programs and secondary prevention, early detection, screening programs, and the like. The fence represents primary prevention, keeping things from happening in the first place, immunizations perhaps. And moving the population away from the edge of the cliff is about addressing the social determinants of health. The determinants of health that are outside the individual, that are beyond our genes, beyond our individual behaviors, and are actually the context in which our individual behaviors either confer protection or risk. So those social determinants of health, as I'm sure you all well know, being here at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, include things like neighborhood conditions, poverty or wealth, whether or not you're living in a food desert or have many farmers markets right around you, whether there are jobs available in your neighborhood or transportation to get to a job, whether it's safe to go out walking for exercise, are the parks where the children frolic and play, or the parks where the drugs being sold, that type of thing. So the context. But as useful as this diagram might be, for example, to go into a community and asking, where should we be spending our resources? I think everybody would want some of all of this, or even if we want to go to the Congress and say, where should we be spending our health resources as a nation? It's a matter of emphasis. We want some of all of it, but perhaps all of us in this room would say most of it should be about addressing the social determinants of health, moving the population away from the edge of the cliff. But as useful as this diagram is so far, it has a fatal flaw. And that flaw is that it does not yet address how health disparities arise. So I want you to keep this cliff in the back of your mind, but we're going to shift gears for just a moment to talk about how health disparities arise on 3 levels, where when you're thinking about racial ethnic health disparities, unfortunately, we have lots of evidence about differences in the quality of care received within the healthcare system. The Institute of Medicine in 2002 released its unequal treatment report, which pulled together what were then hundreds of studies. If we were to do the same thing again, it would be thousands of studies documenting differences in how vigorously your heart disease symptoms might be attended to, depending on your race. or how much pain medication you might get in an emergency department if you came in with a long bone fracture, depending on your race or your ethnicity. But even the Institute of Medicine panel that released that unequal treatment report, even they said it's not about looking at differences in quality of care if you are in the same system, the VA or Medicare, or have the same insurance, because there are differences in access to health care in the first place. That's a second level at which health disparities arise. But then we, recognizing that health does not arise within the healthcare system, is not determined within the healthcare system, recognize the third very important differences in where health disparities arise. And those are differences in our life opportunities, exposures, stresses. And when we think about these three levels at which health disparities arise, differences in quality of care, differences in access to care, differences in underlying exposures and opportunities, it's really like a huge pyramid, or an iceberg where the huge hidden base are the differences in the quality of our lives. And then the very same people who are being made sicker are sometimes the ones who are frustrated because of limited access to the system. And then even the lucky ones who get into the system are sometimes further injured because of differences in quality of care. So now, remembering these three levels at which health disparities arise, we're going to go back to our cliff. But now we're going to recognize that we're really not dealing with a flat two-dimensional cliff, but actually we're dealing with a three-dimensional cliff. And at some parts of the cliff, there's an ambulance there, but maybe that ambulance right there has a flat tire, like Dr. Levis does right now, my host, who's not here yet. But anyway, maybe that ambulance has a flat tire. And maybe that flat tire makes it slow or go off in the wrong direction. Or maybe there's no ambulance there at all, and maybe there's no net nor fence. And usually at those parts of the cliff, the population is being pushed closer to the edge. So now that we recognize that we're dealing with a three-dimensional cliff, I want to talk about how we can see how health disparities arise. Well, the differences in quality of care, that's when the ambulance is there, but it's slower, goes off in the wrong direction. Just called your name. Talking about the flat tire. Anyway, so the differences in quality of care, that's when the ambulance is slower, goes off in the wrong direction. Differences in access to care are no ambulance, no net, no fence. And differences in underlying exposures and opportunities is represented by the closer proximity of that greenie population to the edge. So now I want to make a distinction between what I described as addressing the social determinants of health, moving the population away from the edge of the cliff, and a new level of work that we have to do. Okay? Because we have to ask ourselves, now that we recognize that we're dealing with a three-dimensional cliff, how did the cliff become three-dimensional in the first place? And that's usually because of historical injustices perpetuated by contemporary structural factors. But given that it's three-dimensional, why are there differences in resources along the cliff face? And why are there differences in who's found at different parts of the cliff? Why are the oranges back here in a way and the greenies being pushed closer to the edge? And when you start asking these kinds of questions and addressing these issues, you are now doing what I describe as addressing the social determinants of equity, which are different from the social determinants of health. The social determinants of equity include systems of power for distributing resources and populations. So this is where racism, or sexism, or heterosexism, or economic systems like capitalism come into play. So now, with this cliff, I've actually distilled three dimensions of health intervention, where the first dimension, which we can see along a line, you'll remember one dimension in geometry is a line, we can see that first dimension, health services, along the edge of the cliff. And this is where, if you say the word health anywhere in this country, people will complete that thought for you and say health care or health services. This is what most people think of when you think anything about health. But this is our ambulance, our net, and our fence, our curative and preventive health services. And I would dare say that all of us in this room would be devoted to trying to get universal access to a high-quality healthcare system. But we recognize, because we've already seen about the need to move the population away from the edge of the cliff and acknowledge the three-dimensionality, we know that universal access to high-quality health care in and of itself will not result in large and sustained improvements in health outcomes or the elimination of health disparities, but it is what you do when you're living in a civilized society that values all of its population equally. But if we do want to have large and sustained improvements of health outcome, we have to recognize that as good as our system is, we can overwhelm it if we have a lot of people pushed against the edge. And so we must go into that second dimension, which we can display in a flat plane in 2 dimensions and talk about moving the population away from the edge of the cliff, addressing neighborhood conditions, addressing poverty and the like. But if we do that without recognizing that we're dealing with a 3-dimensional cliff, we can actually make health disparities worse. So we must acknowledge the 3-dimensionality of the cliff and address the social determinants of equity, including racism, sexism, heterosexism, and the like, if we're going to achieve social justice and eliminate health disparities. Now, usually, I would stop here and engage questions, and I do want questions all along the way. So if somebody has a really burning question or comment or an amen or a challenge, anything at any point, just wave your hand, and at this point I would just repeat your question and try to answer it. But because I'm looking at the clock and I have so many different things and stories I want to share with you, unless there's something pressing, I'll carry on. Is there some comment at this point? Well, this cliff is useful for a number of reasons. For today's purpose, here I am talking to you, health people, and I've already said the word racism 3 or 4 times, and nobody's fallen out of their chair. Okay. So for a general audience, this is how I use this story. I also use it so that medical people who are ambulance drivers recognize all the other levels that are in the health enterprise and recognize that they, in their clinical roles, can also, in their citizen roles after work, be addressing the social determinants of equity. And I also, very importantly, make this because the distinction between social determinants of health as the context in which we live our lives that make us sick or keep us well, and the social determinants of equity as the forces, the systems of power that determine the range of context and who's living in which context, that distinction is very important. And so I use this for that. But now I'm going to turn squarely to a discussion of racism as one of those social determinants of equity. And when I say the word racism, what do I mean? Well, I'm clear, first of all, that I'm talking about a system. I'm not talking about an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. I'm talking about a system of power. And a system of doing what? It's a system of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how we look, which is what we call race in this country. I'm just going to take a sidebar there to say, look at me here in Baltimore, and I'm clearly black. But if you were to look at me in some parts of Brazil, I would be just as clearly white. If you were to look at me in South Africa, I would be clearly colored. And here I am with the same physical appearance, but the social interpretation of my appearance in those 3 settings would assign me to 3 different racial groups. And furthermore, if I were to stay in any of those settings long enough, then my health outcome would probably take on that of the group to which I've been assigned, even though I have the same genes in all 3 places. So that's what I mean when I say that race is the social interpretation of how we look. In other words, race is not biology. I hope that I don't have to do a 3-hour talk on that here. What are the impacts of this system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on so-called race? Well, racism unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. And when we think or talk about racism at all in this country, which is very rarely, but when we do, this is where we go. But it doesn't take very long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage. So that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege, which we hardly ever touch in this country. But then, even as we recognize that we're dealing with a system that's either unfairly disadvantaging or unfairly advantaging individuals and communities, racism is also sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And examples of that include how we as a nation are not investing in the full, vigorous, excellent public education of all of our kids. It's as if the blinders of racism have made us believe there is no genius over there in the barrios or in the ghettos or in the reservations. We can get along very well, thank you, without those kids. But of course there is genius in all of our communities, and if we were to fully invest in all of that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation, or even as a world. And I am accustomed to saying that I think we would already be up on Mars farming by now, if that were a good idea. And you know, there are people now trying to get up there, at least on a one-way ticket. I don't know if you've heard about that. But another way that racism saps the strength of the whole society is how these blinders have made us complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many black and brown men in our prison system, which is separating us from human potential. And if you know people who are either stuck in the prison system or are cycling in and out, unable to vote in many states, unable to get public housing, unable to get a job because of the box, have you committed a felony, right? If you know any of those people, you know there are many, many geniuses caught up in this system that if there had only been some other opportunity for them, they could be contributing very positively to our society. Many examples of how racism saps the strength of the whole society. And I think it's important for us to talk about the unfair disadvantage, to talk about the reciprocal unfair advantage. And I'm going to give you some tools for talking about that in a moment. But really, if I had to pick one of those bullets, I would say that if we focused our research and our media conversations and the conversations around our dinner tables around how racism saps the strength of the whole society, then we would get a lot more traction and a lot more people invested in dismantling this system and putting in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. Now, this definition of racism I just gave is all well and good for a kind of a general framing. But if we want to find out how does racism become obesity? How does racism cause, racial differences in asthma prevalence and the like? I find it useful to talk about these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. Now, many of you may have read my Gardener's Tale allegory. Who has read my Gardener's Tale allegory or heard it? Okay, well, good. So there are not so many. So those of you who've heard it, you're going to hear it again, and your job is to try to hear it in a way that you can tell it tonight, okay? And for the others, this is going to be new. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define each of these levels of racism, give you examples about how they can impact health, and then illustrate these with a teaching story, my Gardener's Tale allegory. The first level of racism that I talk about is institutionalized racism, that system, those structures, policies, practices, norms, values, that results in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. Differential something by race at the institutionalized level is differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that does not require an identifiable perpetrator. This is the kind of racism that often shows up as inherited disadvantage or its reciprocal inherited advantage. This is the kind of racism that has been institutionalized in our laws and in our structures and policies and in our normative assumptions. And it shows up in terms of material conditions and in terms of access to power. So examples include differential access to quality housing, or equal educational opportunities, or equal employment opportunities, or even the same level of income at the same level of employment. And all of these things can impact your health. Differential access to medical facilities, even linguistic access to medical facilities. Differential access to a clean environment and the disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites in communities of color. In terms of information, differential access to information which could be health information or even information about our own histories. Power as resources, material resources, social networking resources, knowing somebody on the board. Differential access to voice in media, voice in government, and the like. Now, here's another tool I'm going to give you for starting a national conversation on racism. And this tool is going to be to answer a question that sometimes comes up, because sometimes people look at this list and they say, that first bullet under examples, housing, education, employment, income, Dr. Jones, don't we call that social class? So are you talking about racism, or are you really talking about social class? That's a very important question, and many people in this room are waiting for me to answer that question right now. Okay, what are you going to say about that, right? My answer to that starts with the observation that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized, oppressed, stigmatized group, there's been some initial historical insult. So for American Indians, it was the taking of the land and the genocide, and then the moving of the survivors to the reservations. And then in some instances, if something good was found under the land of one reservation, picking people up and moving them to another place. For people who were in Mexico, it's when Mexico became New Mexico, and then the continued usury of immigrant labor, migrant labor, with a disdain for immigration to this day for our agricultural industry. For people of Chinese descent, you know, the Chinese men were brought here to build our railroads, unable to bring their families and unable to marry. For people of African descent, it started with the kidnapping of West African people. And then our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But people have stopped me there too, and they say, oh, Dr. Jones, Dr. Jones, don't you recognize that the enslaved people were emancipated in 1865? And that is now fully 150 years ago. All else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase there is all else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are still today what I describe as contemporary structural factors that are perpetuating those initial historical insults. These are in our laws, even in how we fund public schools in many places, most places based on local property taxes. If you have a poorly funded school, usually poor outcomes, and another generation lost. So when people ask me, are you talking about racism or are you talking about social class? I say that institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. And so this is the tool for you now, because when people ask you, are you talking about social class? Really, what does race or racism, which is the harder word to say, have to do with anything? You have to explain that as important as income inequality is, and as important as eradicating poverty is, if you were to give me a magic wand today to eradicate poverty and even equalize incomes, I would go that far. Boom, 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 I would do that. But if we didn't pay attention to the background structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that were put in place to differentially shunt different populations to different possibilities, even if I were to equalize income today, within 20 years, within one generation, I think we would start to see a stratification by race again in terms of social class. That's an important insight. And you need to be able to communicate that. Are there any questions about that? Or you guys understand what I'm saying? Because this is an important thing. So, before I get off of institutionalized racism, I also need to say that it can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. And very often, institutionalized racism shows up as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. This is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the prejudice, the different idea, and the discrimination, the different action. And this is what many people call interpersonal racism. I call it personally mediated racism, which is quite a mouthful. But I call it that because I'm still understanding racism as a system, and this is a system mediated through people. How could this impact your health? Well, this is a very old slide. That top bullet, police brutality. I used to say, imagine that you were driving while black or driving while Latino and pulled over for that and interpreted as resisting arrest and then hit upside the head or worse. But now all I have to say is Eric Garner or Michael Brown or Tamir Rice or the guy in the Walmart whose name I don't come up right now with the toy gun, or the guy in the darkened vestibule in Brooklyn just walking up the stairs. Or even, it doesn't have to be police brutality. It could be a neighborhood watchman who thinks that he's protecting his neighborhood from you as you're walking in your father's neighborhood with the store, Trayvon Martin. Or Jordan Davis sitting in a car playing music. There are a lot of times where your health is severely impacted because other people's assumptions about your abilities, motives, and intents. And this actually is making the time ripe for national conversation on racism. And I think we need to go with that. Physician disrespect, which can be as subtle as a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because the physician figures, well, that patient couldn't afford or wouldn't comply or wouldn't understand or whatever they assume. Or it could be quite blatant, like sterilization abuse, which has had many iterations in our nation's history. Shopkeeper vigilance, being followed around in stores, not even asked, may I help you, but just being followed around under surveillance. Or waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatment. And these are two manifestations of what many people call everyday racism. These are manifestations of the microaggressions that probably are related to elevated blood pressures in minority communities that don't go down at night. Teacher devaluation. which can be a very important manifestation of personally mediated racism. When a teacher looks at a young child and thinks, oh, that child can't learn, and puts them off in the ADD track, that child will never even know, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. Before I leave personally mediated racism, I have to say that it, like institutionalized, can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. But even more important for this level is that personally mediated racism can be unintentional as well as intentional. You don't have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism that I describe, internalized racism, I define as acceptance by members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. Here I'm speaking from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races. And I have colleagues who do anti-racism training who say, well, Dr. Jones, or they say, Kamara, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people are walking around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? And I agree, but I'm not talking about that here. I'm going to put that off in my background normative stuff in terms of institutionalized. So here I'm talking about internalized racism by members of the stigmatized races. How could this impact your health? Examples include self-devaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as. Maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school or apply to that college or try to get to Hopkins in the School of Public Health. Maybe I shouldn't apply for that job or try to live in that neighborhood. And the self-devaluation even turns into fratricide, black on black or Latino on Latino crime. Because if you don't value yourself, then you won't value somebody who looks just like you, and you just as soon off them as not. The white man's ice is colder syndrome. That phraseology comes from my parents' generation, and what it meant then and what it still means for many people today is, say you're a person of color, say you're black and you need a lawyer. You might go and seek a white lawyer over a black lawyer. Or if you need a doctor, you might seek out a white doctor over a black doctor. In fact, if your lemonade were warm, you might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. Resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, which turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors, turns into not voting or not registering to vote, and even not voting even if you are registered, and those things have health impacts as well. And really, the internalized racism is about members of stigmatized races accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So when you hear young high school students of color, and one of them is trying to be the valedictorian, and others are teasing that person by saying, oh, well, you know, so-and-so is trying to be white, we need to challenge that, because since when did white people claim exclusive access to excellence? They did not. So now I'm going to illustrate these three levels of racism with my Gardner's tale allegory. But before I tell you the teaching story about racism, I'm going to tell you what I saw with my own real eyes at 2615 Talbot Road in Baltimore in Windsor Hills, which is the place where the Gardner's tale was born. So, because all of my allegories are based on something I saw with my own real eyes. So my husband and I had just moved back to Baltimore, newlywed. I was going to come finish up my PhD in epi here. We bought our first freestanding house, 2615 Talbot Road, beautiful house with a big wraparound porch with flower boxes all over the porch. I've gone by recently, the flower boxes are still there. I thought I should take a picture of them, but anyway. So we bought the house in October. It wasn't really the time to be planting things, but when spring came, we were all excited. So we're going to go and decorate our porch with flowers. And as we're going out there to do this, we look and we see that some of the boxes have dirt in them already, and some of the boxes were empty. So my husband very dutifully goes down to the gardening store. He hauls big old bags of potting soil back, and we fill up the empty boxes. And then we take our marigold seeds, is what we were planting at the time, and we put equal numbers of seeds in all of the boxes, and we water them. And I'm not the gardener in the family, so I just sit back, going to be delighted, right? Well, 3 weeks later, I'm walking out of my front door onto my porch, and I stopped in my tracks. Because what I saw made me think that we had planted completely different species in some of the boxes compared to others. Because some of the boxes were full of plants, and they were full of tall, vigorous-looking plants. And other boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that we had bought was rich, fertile soil, and every single seed planted in that rich, fertile soil had sprouted. The strong seed was very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed, it made it halfway up. But that old soil that we had found in the boxes turned out to be poor, rocky soil. So the weak seed planted in the poor rocky soil had just died. And even the strong seed in that poor rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. And maybe you guys are gardeners. So maybe you've composted half of your garden. And maybe you've seen this, what I saw with my eyes, with your own real eyes. And this is really an image about the importance of the soil, right? The importance of the environment. But now I'm going to take this image and I'm going to make it a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we have a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She puts the red seed in the rich, fertile soil and the pink seed in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, in her flower boxes, she sees what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all of the red seed has sprouted, and the strong red seed is growing very tall and vigorous, and even the weak red seed has made it halfway up. In that poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died, and here comes the strong pink seed just struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in these two flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens. And finally, about 10 years later, the gardener is coming and she's looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we're going to interrupt the story there to say that the first part of this story is about how institutionalized racism works, where you had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But now you have to ask, well, where is personally mediated racism in this garden? Well, the gardener's looking over at red, thinking red is beautiful. And she looks over at pink and she says, oh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly, so she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she's noticed that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, and she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, going to school, going to work, living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees. And the bees are minding their own business, collecting nectar. But of course, they're pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee bzz, into one of the pink flowers, and then bzz, into another pink flower, and then bzz, to this other pink flower. And that flower says, get away from me, bee. Do not bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start by addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that's an important intervention. I'm not making light of that. But if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you say, okay, well, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener. Or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. It's all good. So we're going to have our workshop, and at the workshop we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't, right? But even if she does, it's not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. I think that if we really want to set things right in the garden, we need to address the institutionalized racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although in my mind it makes it easier going forward to continue segregating resources. But if you keep separate boxes, it means you have to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious. And in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, you will also be addressing the internalized racism, because pink will no longer be looking over at red thinking that red is more beautiful, because they'll be equally beautiful, right? And in that intervention on the institutionalized, you may also address the personally mediated racism. Now, that original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children growing up and seeing the flowers equally beautiful would be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized, and to very strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. Good if we address all the levels at the same time, but at least address the institutionalized, and when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. Now, there's one more question before we leave the gardener's tale that I haven't raised yet, and that is, who is the gardener? After all, I gave the gardener the power to decide, the power to act, or agency, and so often we set up agencies for people instead of giving people their own agency, right? But this power to decide, power to act, and control of resources. And in my mind, these are the elements of self-determination. So who is the gardener? Well, this slide used to say, who is the gardener? Government, power to decide, power to act, control of resources. But that was before I worked at CDC. So I changed my slide. But clearly, government is a big part of the gardener, but not the only part of the gardener. Media, foundations, corporations, even communities, to the extent that they have self-determination, are part of the gardener. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink. It's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity. The gardener is probably looking at her flower box is thinking that her garden is beautiful because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. And so our challenge is what to do about the gardener. Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow or recruit their own gardener? Lots of questions can come out of this. And if you have a question now, I want you to jot it down because I do want to hear it, but I do want to carry on because I have 3 more allegories and a little more stuff that I want to share with you. But before we leave, I do want to share with you a question that was raised many years ago now with me after this story. And the question was, why should the red flowers share their soil? Now that's an interesting question, right? First of all, it shows to me the power of the allegory, because if we were talking about racism between you and me, that would never come up, right? But my answer to why should the red flowers share their soil is that that soil does not belong to the red flowers. It belongs to the garden. The other observation is, what if that's not the original gardener, but that's the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchildren? Here we are, right? What then? And so the first part is for the gardener or the great-great-great-great-grandchild to recognize that there is a problem here. And at least on the health front, we have now made achieving health equity a goal, so that the differences in the heights and vigors of the pink and red flowers is now problematized. Starting in 1998 with the 16th Surgeon General, Dr. David Satcher, and President Clinton announcing the initiative to eliminate racial ethnic health disparities by the year 2010. You guys, some of you are so young, you didn't even know we had that initiative. And we have passed 2010, and we weren't successful, but that initiative at least set a new agenda. Because it used to be for our healthy people, public health goals for the nation every 10 years, that if this were black infant mortality and this were white infant mortality, it used to be for 1990 and 2000 that we were supposed to go black from here to here and white from here to here. But starting with 2010, we were supposed to eliminate that gap. So that's the first thing. But then the question is how? And in order for us to get a sense of how, we need to make those flower boxes transparent. We need to be talking about the differences in the quality of the soil. And we also need to make it clear that those pink seed didn't just jump into that poor rocky soil. Right? So we also need to bring history into all of our deliberations. If you're ever at any problem-solving table, you need to ask the question, how did the problem come to be this way? And that will give you so much more traction on untangling that problem and solving it. So if you don't remember anything else, remember, take history with you everywhere. We tend to be an ahistorical society, and that is to our disadvantage. But now I'm going to carry on just with 2 quick observations about measuring institutionalized racism, because after all, I just said that institutionalized racism is the most important. There are 2 levels of measuring institutionalized racism. The first is scanning for evidence of racial disparities, not just in outcomes, but also in terms of opportunities, asking the question, could racism be operating here? But we have already lots of evidence that racism could be operating here. All we have to do is look at how education is distributed in this country, or income, or any of that. So yeah, racism could be operating here. Some people might argue with you and say, oh, well, that's because certain people are lazy or stupid, right? So you do have to deal with that, and I'll hopefully give you some tools for that in a sec. But yeah, racism could be operating here, but so what? So what? What are we going to do about it? And this is where we have to understand that racism is not a cloud, it's not a miasma that you can't get your hands on, but it is a system with identifiable and addressable mechanisms. So the second thing is to identify the mechanisms of institutionalized racism. That is taking the question, how is racism operating here with you everywhere? To your classroom, to this school, to Baltimore, to this state, to this nation, to your children's school, wherever it is. How is racism operating here? Looking at structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, where the structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision making. Who's at the table and who's not? What's on the agenda and what's not? And actually, most of you, all of you, I dare say, will be at some decision-making tables at some point in your career. And I want to give you this as a tool. Whenever you're sitting at a decision-making table, look around and say, who is not here who has an interest in this proceeding, right? And then your job is not just to represent them in the short term, but to try to find them a way to the table in the long term. So if structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, policies are the written how, it's a little easier to see and to critique. Although sometimes you have to also use that negative thinking too and say, well, what policies are not on the book that if put in place could be useful in this setting? So you have to get used, you have to train your mind to see what is not, who is not at this table, what is not being presented to me, what is not on the agenda. Okay, it's a way of thinking that will help you. Well, if policies are the written how, then practices and norms are the unwritten how, and that's harder for us to measure and get a handle on. It's like the shoulder tapping, do you want to be on this board? But that's also important for us to understand. And then the values, the why. I never used to talk about values. My whole gardener's tale for many years was just about the importance of equalizing the conditions in the soil. Until I recognized that the gardeners, even if we did that today, the gardener's initial preference for red over pink would continue to hold sway. That is, the gardener's initial preference for red over pink is the value piece. It's what some people call cultural racism, and we must address that as well. Now, that definition that I gave you of racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on so-called race can actually be generalized to be a definition of any system of inequity. So you could say, what is sexism? That's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender that unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And there are many axes of inequity that are operating in our society: race, gender, ethnicity, labor roles, sexual orientation, geography, religion, all of these. And these are operating not just in our society, but intersecting in communities and even in individuals. I recognize that. I focus my work on race as the axis of inequity and racism as a system, not because I don't recognize that all of this is going on, but because racism is foundational in our nation's history, and yet so many people are in denial of its continued existence and impacts on the health and well-being of the nation. But I do recognize all of this, and all of these axes of inequity are operating at least as risk markers for how opportunity is structured and value is assigned. Some of them are also in the pathway as risk factors, but these are all risk markers. So achieving health equity, that was sort of like the big title of my talk. I'm going to share with you, before I share 3 more allegories, very quick ones, I'm going to share with you my definition of health equity, which is a 3-part definition of health equity. What is it? How do we get there? And how is it related to health disparities? This differs from the Healthy People 2020 definition, to which I also contributed. But the Healthy People 2020 definition got stuck in print, and I've been able to carry on. So I'll tell you what the differences are. So my definition of health equity is that it is assurance of the conditions for optimal health for all people. Assurance is a process. In fact, it's one of the 3 core functions of public health identified by the Institute of Medicine, along with assessment and policy development. The Healthy People 2020 definition is that health equity is achievement of the highest level of health for all people. But that's a one-off. Maybe we hit that yesterday. In my mind, health equity is a process, and it's assurance. Assurance of what? Of the conditions for optimal health, the social determinants of health. For whom? For all people. Not all people, especially anybody, but for all people. How do we get there? Achieving health equity requires at least these 3 things: valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources according to need. And how is it related to health disparities? Health disparities will be eliminated when health equity is achieved. Health disparities is about counting the different numbers of different colored bodies at the bottom of the cliff, or the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers. But health equity is about the conditions of the soil. It's about all of the resources and their distribution along the cliff face. Who has ever heard of this, ICERD, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination? So I see a few hands. What is this? This is an international anti-racism treaty that was adopted by the UN General Assembly way back in 1965. Wow. Who knew, right? Do you think the US has signed this treaty? No, right. But surprise, surprise, yes, we did. We signed it. We did. We signed it in 1966.
Somebody was asleep.
Somebody was asleep. Well, no, the key there is that our diplomats can go signing whatever treaties they want to. But the Senate has to ratify a treaty before it takes force. Do you think the US Senate ratified this treaty? Well, it sounds like a trick question, right? But we did. We did. Took 28 years, but 28 years later, the US Senate ratified this International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. What it means is that today, we have international treaty obligations to do right by this 9-page treaty. One of the obligations is to submit periodic reports. I'm going to tell you first about the second of our periodic reports. The reports are supposed to be every 2 years, but we're allowed to bundle them into 6-year GLOMs, 3 reports at a time. And these reports are actually prepared by our State Department. I'm not making this stuff up. I mean, this is very high-level stuff, right? So we submitted our second report to this UN committee in 2007, and the committee gets our report, and then they get parallel or shadow or alternative reports from anybody else who wants to send information. They consider it, and then they send back to each country their concluding observations. So for that second report, we got our concluding observations in May of 2008. It's only 14 pages. It's a nice, quick read. You can do it at next weekend. And it starts out, "Dear United States, thank you for your report. We remain concerned about racial profiling, residential segregation, disproportionate incarceration, differential access to health care, the achievement gap in education," and on and on and on, for 46 paragraphs. Paragraph 13 is, "Dear United States, you need to establish a mechanism for ensuring compliance with this treaty at the federal, state, and local levels." And paragraph 43, "Dear United States, you need to make sure that your population knows about the existence of this treaty." So now every time I talk, I do my part, right? But the third report we actually submitted in 2013. It was a 69-page report. Interesting. I'm not going to, it's interesting reading. It differed from the report that the Bush administration submitted. Bush administration submitted a report that sort of the synopsis would be, "We have laws against this, thank you very much," right? And the Obama administration report was like, "We have laws against this, thank you very much, but we recognize that sometimes we don't get the impact, so then we're trying to bring, have recourse." And I think really what our next report should say is, this is how we are going to proactively make sure that things are right, as opposed to just trying to redress infractions when we have problems. Anyway, so there were 82 parallel reports submitted, and the committee considered it in 2014. And actually, I just on the airplane like 2 or 3 days ago when I was flying to Seattle, found the third concluding observation. So I haven't gone through it and parsed it in detail, but I highly recommend that you do that. I think it's less than 14 pages. I do see that they said something about having a national, when I read it, I read national conversation on racism. They didn't put exactly those words, but they said there has to be a national effort to bring these issues to the attention of everybody in the country. So again, here's a tool perhaps, not just for us launching a national conversation on racism, but for organizing in communities. These are things that we have international treaty obligations to address. Though they say, they give specific recommendations. Please look at that. And this is where you can find the third concluding observations. If you just Google ICERD, you'll find it. So now I want to close with 3 very quick allegories that I hope you'll be able to remember and tell to your roommates or your husbands or wives or your children or somebody tonight. Okay, so here's your challenge for all of you. The first of these allegories, Japanese lanterns, color perceptions, was sparked by an experience I had when I was in medical school at Stanford. And I was invited to a garden party at a faculty member's house. How lovely, right? How lovely is that? And there were Japanese lanterns and colored light bulbs just, festooning the garden. And I liked to chit and chat for a while, but I then got a little tired. So I decided as the night was falling that I would just sit on one side of the garden and let the conversation and music just wash over me. So as I'm sitting there, I became fascinated by a group of pink moths, and I was just gazing at those moths. And then I looked away a little bit, and I saw, oh my goodness, look at the green moths over there, and the blue moths up there. And isn't it interesting how they're sorting according to their kind? Right? Now, you can't believe that I was thinking this, but honestly, I was until I was like, whoa, you know, because of course I realized I could have been looking in another part of the garden talking about yellow or purple or orange moths. And those of us who have seen moths in a universal light recognize there's no such thing as pink or purple or blue or any of those colored moths, but that moths really are different colors from one another, but they're different colors of tan and brown and speckled and splotched. But this is when I understood how the colors that we think we see are due to the lights by which we look, and the colored lights distort and mask our own true variability. And this got me to thinking about what is race and how do the racial categories that we construct color and constrain our notion of who we are. And so to me, this was a very nice illustration about race as a social classification, not a biologic descriptor. It's a social interpretation of how one looks in a race-conscious society. That is, a society that's hanging up pink and purple and blue light bulbs, that's what you're going to see, right? And only when you're in a society that has a universal light that allows for all possibility will you see the real variability that we have as moths or as people. So the second of the three stories, Dual Reality, a Restaurant Saga, was also sparked by my observation when I was a medical student. Fertile time to be thinking, I guess. Anyway, I was studying late with some friends. We were hungry. There was no food around us, and so we went into Palo Alto to try to get something to eat. And we found a restaurant. We went in, we sat down, we ordered our food is served, and here we are eating. And that's not a very remarkable thing, except that I looked up and I noticed a sign, and the sign was a profound insight, provided me with a profound insight about racism. So now you're like, oh, what kind of restaurant were you in? Right? And what did the sign say? The sign said, open. Now, if I hadn't been thinking anything more about it, here I am sitting at the table of opportunity, eating. I look up, I see a sign that proclaims open, no biggie, right? But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I realized that now, because of the hour, the restaurant was indeed closed, but that hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of the sign, would not be able to come in and eat. And that is when I understood how racism structures open-closed signs in our society, that racism structures a dual reality. And for those people on the inside sitting at the table of opportunity and they look up and they see a sign that proclaims open, it is difficult for them, or it's difficult for any of us, to recognize any system of inequity that privileges us. They will have no idea that this sign is two-sided, right? It's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It's difficult for white people in this country to recognize white privilege and racism. It's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, except when we saw a little bit of that with Ebola, right? But those on the outside are very well aware of the two-sided nature of the sign, because they are seeing a sign that proclaims closed to them, and yet they're looking through the window and seeing people inside eating. So back for those on the inside who are saying, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I acknowledge that it's hard to know that when you only see open. And I also acknowledge that it's a privilege that you don't have to know that, right? That's part of the privilege. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to acknowledge that racism exists. It's an empowering thing. It doesn't compel you to act, but it enables you to act. It enables you to talk to the restaurant owner and say, you know, there are hungry people outside. If you open your restaurant, more will come in. You might even make more money. Or you might pass some food through the door or break through the glass, or whatever it is, if you care about those people on the outside. But at least you won't be sitting there thinking, oh, why don't they just come on and sit down and eat, right? So this is about racism, and you know, at the beginning how I talked about how it unfairly disadvantages some, unfairly advantages others, but saps the strength of the whole society. Because imagine if we were all in there eating, what kinds of great meetings and plans we could make. The third image is one that is not from my own real eyes. I'm borrowing this image from the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, which is by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who is the president of Spelman College in Atlanta. And so her image is about racism as like living your life on a conveyor belt, right? That you're not really trying to actively be racist, but you're constantly moving through racism and toward racism and all. So I'm going to take her image and I'm going to embellish it so that we can talk about how do we become actively anti-racist. So here we are. We're on this conveyor belt, if I can get us on the conveyor belt. It's not really moving, but anyway, here we are on the conveyor belt with all these other people, and we're just living our lives, going to school, going to work, maybe going to church, our neighborhood organization, and we don't realize that we're moving through and toward racism inexorably, but maybe we look up, right? Now, some people look up and they see racism, and what do? They close their eyes, okay? They're in denial, right? And they keep living. Or maybe some people look up and they see racism, and oh my God, and they just turn around, but they keep sending their kids to school, and also maybe they're colorblind, right? But now here, let me get back to the start of the conveyor belt over here. So here we are now, and we're on this conveyor belt, we're living our lives, but then we come to this talk at noon at school, and oh my God, we look up, and we say, my goodness, there's racism, right? What are we going to do? So maybe we're going to turn around, but we're not just going to stand there turning around. We're going to turn around and we're going to start walking. And you have to walk at least as fast as the conveyor belt is going just to stay in the same position, not to go more deeply into it. So the very act of turning and walking, you're now already starting to become actively anti-racist, right? But what happens when you start walking backward on a crowded conveyor belt? You're going to be bumping into people. And people are going to say, hey, buddy, watch out. Where are you going? Now, here's your opportunity. I've already said that racism is passive. Here's your opportunity to do the first of the 3 stages of being actively anti-racist, which is to name racism. You say, look, where are we going? Do you want to go there, or do you want to turn around with me? Now, most people are going to say, hey, just stop bothering me. Get out of my way, because they just want to go on and live their lives. Don't bother them, right? But maybe 1 or 2 are going to turn around, so now you're 2 or 3 walking backwards, and now you're not just trying to stay in the same place, you're actually trying to make some progress going backward, because where are we headed? We're headed to look at the motor that is running this conveyor belt. We're now going to be bumping into people, and now we have 20 or 30. You're never going to get 50% of anybody, right? But you're going to get more and more, and now we're marching, 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 and look, here's the motor. We found the motor of the conveyor belt. So now this is the second stage of being actively anti-racist, which is to ask the question, how is racism operating here? So I'm looking at the motor, and I think, it's this lever. So I grab the lever and I pull it, and lo and behold, that is part of it. And the system stutters, but it's a very fancy system. So it reconfigures itself and it keeps on going, right? So this is the importance of the 3rd stage of being actively anti-racist, which is to organize and strategize to act. So while I'm on here pulling on this lever, you need to be over there pushing this button, and you need to be over there wheeling this dial. And I think that all of us together can dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to our full potentials. And that is the challenge. So here's organize and strategize to act. These last 3 stories, Japanese Lanterns, Color Perceptions, is about race as a social construct. Dual Reality, a restaurant saga, is about racism as creating a dual or multi-sided sign in our society. And the fact that we recognize it's hard to recognize that the 2-sidedness of the sign if you're on the inside, but don't be afraid to understand it, because that can be empowering. And the 3rd, Life on a Conveyor Belt, Moving to Action, is about us becoming actively anti-racist. That racism is not a miasma, that we can start interrogating the mechanisms, take the question, how is racism operating here with us everywhere? Be unafraid to name racism, to put it on agendas. And I really do believe that working together, we can dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. I encourage you to join me in that. Thank you very much, and I love your questions. Thank you. Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think we have a few minutes for some questions. Right here.
Yes.
Rachel.
And I don't know if there's a mic that will come around. Oh, yeah, why don't people line up at mics? Can you go? And we do have a little time for questions. So what I want to do is maybe listen to 4 questions at once, and then I'll respond, and then if there are 4 more questions. So if you have a question, get up at the mic. I won't go, question, answer, question, answer. We want to hear all the questions, and then I'll answer. Okay, yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much. That was an incredible, just phenomenal, and very inspiring lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I guess I'm interested specifically as public health students and aspiring professionals, how you think we can use the tools of public health to talk about racism or social determinants of equity. I think a lot of times when the field is talking about this, and more often than not, I think it's not talking about this, but when it is, I think it is focusing on the people who are at the bottom of, or the opportunities that are at the bottom of the cliff. And I think certainly the way that opportunity is funded in the field of public health, I'm just not so sure where the opportunities are to really get at interventions that are on a structural level and not a very, very biomedical, individual level. So just if you could speak about, just using the tools of public health to address structural racism, institutionalized racism, I would really appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. I need a piece of paper here, but that's all right. I have it in my mind. So we'll go to this mic, this mic, this mic, okay? I'm going to take all your questions first because, oh, paper.
You need a pen?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Okay, this mic. Okay, this mic.
I'm gonna keep it quick. Have you ever seen a space or an organization or just a situation where the people actually embrace and practice anti-racism?
Okay. Over here. Yes.
Here we go. Thank you, Dr. Jones. I was really struck by the Japanese lantern allegory. Thank you very much for that. My wife sent me a text message a couple of days ago. It was a picture of a dress. I thought she was going to send me another picture that was a second dress. Which one should I get? I'm at the store right now. But it was actually, what color is this dress? And my instinct was, what the dress wants to be. Of course, I told her that I thought it was a blue and a black dress. But she, in fact, saw the complete opposite. She thought it was a white and gold dress. And so, struggling with this, we were trying to figure out how to explain this to our 6-year-old daughter, how mom and daddy can see the same dress in a different way. And I wanted to explain to her that, color is not a quality intrinsic to this dress. It's our cognitive construction of that quality. So, how can we explain these to our children? My 6-year-old daughter, my 2-year-old son, someday I want to be able to give them real examples of how we can do this. These algorithms are wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take the other 2 questions standing there, and then I'll respond.
Thank you so much for your talk. I like what you said about mixing up the soil and how you said it might be easier right now for us to work separately as different communities of color. And that would be easier than mixing up the soil in terms of equity. What are your suggestions for people outside the black or binary in moving towards more equity?
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
You made a point as pertains to the high-profile police brutality incidents that have occurred. And to be honest with you, I try to remain optimistic in terms of not only my professional role being entrenched in anti-racism or unconscious bias presentations in life, but the reality is that we've had many missed opportunities, and again, staying optimistic, being a parent and raising 2 African-American sons.
Right.
I mean, beginning with the election of President Obama, as well as the incident, the high-profile incident of Dr. Henry Gates from Harvard University, who was accused of breaking into his own house, and that was maybe a prime time by which we could have had a national dialogue. So I want you to share with us, when do you think we're going to have a national dialogue to really address it in a meaningful way?
Did you have one more?
Hi, Dr. Jones. I'm Denise Sharma. I actually met you at Social Medicine Rounds a couple of years ago because I graduated from your
Yay.
So it's great to see you again. I wanted to talk with you, and I think we touched about this a few years ago, but just sort of the conveyor belt in regards to power and also being a woman of color and being in a position where you can have those conversations in an institutional setting. However, I just want to know from your experience how you were able to sort of infiltrate that in a way that actually can have a meaningful discussion, because a lot of times folks will give a lot of lip service in an institution, but not necessarily act when you're the one who wants to act. They can be there, but aren't necessarily giving the opportunity.
These are great questions. Okay, so I'm going to try to go. Tools of public health to address structural racism. First of all, the data tools of public health, what we need to do is to shine the bright light of inquiry on everything, and not just on the outcomes, but on the opportunities. So we need to make the differences in the soil transparent. And I even have this little graphic that I haven't published yet, but I'm trying to popularize-ish, that I call my Gartner's tail plot. Because in public health, we actually think that we're doing a lot if we collect data simultaneously by race and social class. I mean, that's a big advance, right? Because usually we either have data by social class or data by race. In this two-part Gartner's tail plot, what you could do, you would have a health outcome on the y-axis, and then you would stratify by social class. I mean, well, you would have social class on the x-axis and stratify by race, and you would be able to see simultaneously the dependence of any health outcome on social class. If that differed by race, that is, if at any given level of social class there were still racial differences, you could look at differences in the slope or whatever. But even if you were to find that in exploding our kind of generic health disparity statistics, that is not enough. Because what if you figured out a way in our public health strategies to make, say, the black and the white diabetes lines identical by social class? And what if you still haven't gotten rid of the black-white disparity in diabetes because of the differences in the underlying distribution of social class by race. That is, if diabetes is more prevalent at lower social classes, and black people are overrepresented at lower social classes, then you're going to still have a black-white disparity. I'm so sorry I don't have the slides, but anyway, the Gartner's tail plot. So what it means there is that we need to do two things. We need to simultaneously collect data by race and social class. We also need to include measures of racism in our data collection things, and one good thing is, how do other people usually classify you in this country? Because, when you say white, black, Hispanic, blah, 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 put all of the groups in there, and that is the substrate on which racism operates day to day. So we could use that socially assigned race in our data, but we also can display health simultaneously by social class and race, and then underneath that, put a plot that shows, a bar plot that shows within each social class category, what is the black percent or whatever, or the white percent. Put a line across that, and if black people are overrepresented in poverty and underrepresented in wealth, you will see that. That is another public health problem, because even if the two lines above were exactly the same, because of an unequal distribution of social class, then you would still have a disparity. It means that public health can't just stay in the realm of looking at health by race and income, that we have to also look at the distribution of income by race. I'm so sorry I got into that without my graphics. But anyway, there it is. Okay, the other thing that we can do in terms of public health is get people to the table. So I talked about the mechanisms being, who's at the table and who's not. Whenever you're at a decision-making table, make sure that people who are impacted by the proceeding are there at the table. Perhaps the School of Public Health could even have community advisory boards for each of the departments here. So it's not just, what do our faculty think is an interesting question to answer? I know I'm going completely against the academic model, but what if our academic departments were responsible to spend at least some of their intellectual resources answering questions that were important to the community? Thank you. So lots of things. So, clearly there are lots of ways. Now, the place to practice anti-racism is what I wrote. Place to practice anti-racism. What did I mean by that?
Or really,
Oh, yes. Okay, there are good places. So Boston Public Health Commission has been actively anti-racist in training all of their staff in racism workshops, 3-day workshops, where half of the workshop, half of the people are staff and half are community, doing that for more than a decade. And lots of policies. Seattle King County Health Department, they even have in law now a statute with, they call them 14 social determinants of health things, but really it gets into the racism and stuff too. Albuquerque, well, the New Mexico State House has an anti-racism resolution type of thing that they're trying to strengthen now. There are people, Alameda County, there are people in different places. And so what we really need is a network for that. There is a new network called Helen, Health Equity, something, but Helen. It's about 6 months old. But if you try to Google Helen, then you can find out what people are doing, and you can add your own efforts to the list. So then you like the Japanese lanterns and the whole, white gold versus blue black. I like that too. Okay. And the person who said that mixing the soil, that I said it's easier for us to go forward. I didn't really say it's easier. Actually, it's easier for the gardener. It's easier for the gardener to think about not mixing up the soil, because those red flowers are going to be talking about, what are you doing with my soil, right? So the gardener who's alive with the red, it's easier for the gardener, but it's not necessarily easier for us or for us to make progress. So that was the one thing. But for people outside the black-white binary, I'm very clear that when I talk about racism, I'm not talking about it in the black-white binary, which has established our country, but there are many, many people who are experiencing racism. And then when you go and you look at these other systems of inequity, including heterosexism and the like, I recognize we all have common struggles, and it will behoove us to recognize the commonality of our struggles and to support one another. But there's so much of a divide and conquer from those on top, the notion that there's a limited pie, and that's how we get used. The high-profile police brutality and all these other opportunities to talk about racism, and when are we going to do it? We're going to do it when you guys start doing it. Don't wait. Don't wait. I think actually the Department of Justice and the White House might be talking about launching something, but don't wait for them to do it. Do it in your classrooms. Do it in your community organizations. If you're part of a sorority or a fraternity or a church, you start doing it. The YWCA has Eliminate Racism, Empower Women as its slogan. I don't know, in some parts of the country they're doing a lot with that, and others are not, but everywhere you see a YWCA, you see that on the board. So we have to start doing it, because if we don't do it, nobody on top is going to do that. And then the conveyor belt and power. Oh, so how have I dealt with women of color, as a woman of color in these conversations? We have to recognize, all of us, even as we're trying to get to a more powerful position, that we have power wherever we are right now. We have the power to disseminate information at the least, to communities or whatever. We have the power, if we're faculty members, to hire students or to admit, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard. Lots of people are afraid to step up and speak out because they want to get to the next rung, and they're only thinking about themselves and they're not thinking about the struggle. So we need to just be unafraid, and it's been hard. And I've made different career changes because it's hard to talk about racism. But I'm still doing it, and I'm hoping to inspire you guys to do it, because I'm getting older. So you guys take it on. So thank you very much.